Hello, friends of the paranormal. I'm here with the paranormalist, Patty Wilson. Patty, how are you this late November day, the last Sunday in November?
I am doing just fine. It was actually pretty sunny this afternoon. I got out for a little bit, did doing some stuff outside, filling bird feeder, taking a little walk, that kind of thing. So I had a really nice Sunday afternoon.
It's not like that where I am.
I'm
You're,
sorry to
you're,
hear that.
you're further south. Today it was just extraordinarily dreary, and I just said, well, I didn't even bother opening the shades today. It was like it was one of those kind of days. So before we get into the normal things that I go through, I would like to thank Lisa for buying us a coffee. And I wish to say, and I wish to reiterate this multiple times, please feel under no obligation to do that. But if you do feel like rewarding us with the buy us a coffee, we certainly won't turn it down. But again, a heartfelt thanks out to Lisa. This is not her first time sending us coffee also. And I know she had asked a question about an episode, so maybe you can take it from
So
there.
yes. So Lisa had asked about doing an episode with German and Bavarian ghostly tales. I love it, and I absolutely plan to. We also had another person mention recently they'd like a episode with trolls. And to the gentleman who said he's been a fan for a long time, thank you, sir. I appreciate it.
Yep, that was a recent post to our Facebook page. And speaking of
Yes.
Facebook page, if you have not subscribed already, please consider doing so. Click the like button. In the description down below, you'll find the link to our Facebook pages. There's actually two of them, one from the previous administration and one from this iteration of the podcast. And pretty much everything else is in the description down below. But again, if you would do us the favor of clicking the like on whatever platform you are, because that is a no-cost way for you to reward us for our efforts too. So we do appreciate that. And what is our topic for today?
Stigmatized haunts. So let me explain.
I'm intrigued. Yeah.
Yeah. So when a property has something really drastic happen there, oftentimes the property is referred to in real estate terms as a stigmatized property, like a murder or a divorce and affair, things like that. Then it becomes more difficult to sell it. And every every state has its own rules on that stuff. Like some states you must, explain to the consumer who might be buying the property, yeah, this is a place where a lot of bad stuff happened. People will recognize it for that. And other ones are less said, the better. So with that said, I found some interesting and unusual properties. Now, a couple of them you may have heard a little bit about before, and I would not have included them because we have talked about them before, except I have new material to share.
Okay, good.
So if you might know of the property, there's stuff that has happened in recent years that is not usually part of the story, but it does definitely apply. So I thought we would start with we're going to Brazil, to a place called the Little Castle of Apa Street. Now it sits in São Paulo, and it was a gorgeous mansion. It looked like a castle. There's no other way to explain it. And it has had a very sad and bizarre history. Now, this street, Apa Street, or Rua Apa, was once the chicest part of Sao Paulo, and the most beautiful homes were built there, very lavish with 30, 40, 50 rooms, and just, gaudy by anybody's estimation, but absolutely beautiful architecture. There was a house there built by a Dr. Rios for his wife, Maria Rios, and he constructed the house in 1912. He supervised it. He brought in an architect from France, and for 5 years they worked on this house. That should tell you how large and ornate this home is. Again, it looks just like a medieval castle.
Okay.
And this house would be known as the Little Castle. by the local people because that's exactly what it is. It's a smaller version of a castle.
Mhm.
It was designed to look like a medieval castle. It was 7,500 square feet. It had towers and was adorned with, sconces and just beautiful architecture on the insides, the outsides. Everything was the best of the best. There were marble staircases with swept around inside, carpets from India, just the most beautiful home he could build with, for his wife and his family. However, um, the architect passed away, excuse me, not the architect, the gentleman, Mr. Rios, passed away in 1937. He left his family's business in the hands of his eldest son. He had two sons, and the two boys, adult men, did not see eye to eye and on anything in their lives. And because the oldest son was in charge of things and mom was kind of leaning on him, his youngest son would get angry and they would have these horrible disagreements that would end up in physical altercations at times. Supposedly one night in a room on the second floor of the structure, there was a huge argument over some business matter. And when it was all said and done, absolute quiet reigns. Somewhere in the evening, the servants go upstairs to see if everything's calmed down and basically how it all shook out. But it shook out in a way that they never anticipated because all three of the family members are dead.
Oh, okay.
So this is a mystery that is still a mystery to this day. So this is what the police would eventually say. They would say that the oldest son got angry, pulled a gun, and shot at his brother, but his mother jumped in front to try to stop the craziness, and she took a bullet first, and then he shot his brother with the second shot, and then turned the gun on himself. The floor is just covered with blood, but there's no evidence of that, and in fact, there is some evidence that another party might have been there because there's two calibers of bullets used. And the police conveniently kind of overlook that thing. But, well, I mean, they at the beginning, they did
Mhm.
try to find other solutions, but when they couldn't, they didn't want to admit that they couldn't figure this out. So they come up with it. It's kind of like uh, the John Kennedy thing with the magic bullet that hit this person, bounced off that person, hit this other, and did it like three twirls around and then went around the back and hit them. And it doesn't make any sense. It's Arlen Specter's magic bullet, but it's their version.
Mhm.
So they are trying to explain away two calibers of guns being used. No second gun found on the site. Because it would be easy to say, well, okay, both boys pulled a gun and shot at each other, and mom was in the middle, you know? But the other son did not have a gun.
But
So
did they find one gun?
they found, yeah, the oldest son had a gun on the ground beside him. But the second son did not have anything, nor did the mother have anything. So where the second gun came from and or went, it has never been resolved.
Okay, the only reason I ask is because there is such a thing as an over under. You actually have a gun with two barrels that could actually shoot two
Yeah.
different calibers. So
They didn't, I mean, I don't know the gun that was involved, but they didn't make a note of that. And I would think that that would be one of those things that the police would have made a note of had it been the case. But, is what it is, right?
mhm.
So as I said, there were two different types of bullets found. Then the oldest son, he had two shots in his chest, which seems inconsistent with suicide, while his mom had been shot 4 times in the chest. So I want you to think that like there's some things that just don't make sense. So his brother, the younger son, is shot with a different gun that isn't there. Mom is shot 4 times, the youngest son is shot twice, and the oldest son is shot twice in the chest. Now, it doesn't make a lot of sense. So there were a lot of things that didn't make any sense at all. If she jumped in front of her one son to protect her other son, I could see one shot, possibly two if he was like that, but like that's a lot. 4 shots.
Well, yeah, and suicides usually don't take two shots.
No, no. not at all.
Uh,
So you can see that there's a lot of ambiguity about the
mhm.
story that the police finally settle upon. So with the whole family dead, the Brazilian law indicated that nobody could inherit because there should have been a direct line of succession for the property. And now they only have like extended family. So it becomes the castle becomes the property of the government. It's empty for a lot of years. They just take ownership and they really don't do anything. So the house pretty much sits, just empty with all the furniture in it, no people there, and on the nobody except for the servants, remembering what's going on. Now stories begin to circulate about this empty house, and they are that people who knew the family would come on the anniversary and they would put flowers, at the door or on the gate or whatever. And, just remember them. And some of them were the servants because they actually, some of them had been with the family a long time. They had seen the boys grow up. Some of them didn't believe the story about the suicide and the accidental shooting of the mom and, all that. They just didn't. And after a while, people started talking about, they would hear screams on the night of the anniversary of the death, kind of an anniversary haunting, or they would hear gunshots going off inside, or they would hear footsteps running, and like somebody was coming to the front door, but the door never opened. And when they called the police and said there's somebody broke into the old home, the police would come out and look, and there would be nothing there. So, and I can make the argument that, hey, maybe there was somebody who broke in and, in the time it took the cops to get there, they hid or they took off somewhere else. However, this went on for many years. And there was a horror movie director from Brazil who eventually gets a chance to go and view this house. And he thinks that this house is amazing. He wants to use it as a location to film a horror movie. And he gets permission to, start shooting there. So he gets the whatever the paperwork needed to be done and all that. And I'm sure the house definitely fit the part because it had been sitting empty and dusty furniture and this, that, and the other, and it has like kind of another year kind of feel to it because it's been many years since the whole thing happened. But here's the weird thing. While he's in the building alone, like prepping for the beginning of the shooting, he dies by a gunshot mysteriously without there being any gun found on the property.
Wow.
So this moves, and so then at that point, the government's like, okay, no, nobody's going in the house anymore. And of course, everything changes. So by the 1980s, the house and the whole neighborhood has it's just decaying. It's run down. It's not the beautiful neighborhood it had once been. Lots of the homes in that area are abandoned because, they require a lot of money to upkeep, and the people that have the houses now don't have that kind of income. And a lot of them really just become drug houses and cheap hotels, places that people that are homeless can crash. Prostitution was being performed inside of some of these homes. And, there were just tent cities in these the grandeur of, and the shadow of this great big old house with these magnificent great gates and all of this. And there's like just people's little tents and lean-tos and what have you there. And it was just really dark and ugly. So in 1990, this woman by the name of Marina Luna, who was a homeless lady who lived on the property where the castle was at, she fell in love with the castle, and she was concerned that they were going to eventually tear it down and it was going to find an ignoble fate like so many of these other buildings. So she begins to petition to make this place a landmark. In 1997, she gets it made a landmark. But more than that, she is actually given permission to operate a preservation group called the Mothers Club, where she operated it out of one of the back rooms of the castle, and it later from an annex of the next door to it as well. So it was designated a landmark, and she receives funds to help get the castle restored. And they used pictures from the murder for to, to
Ooh.
see what it looked like
Oh, okay.
at the
Not for
time.
some morbid curiosity. Okay.
No, no, not so much that, as they didn't have a lot of photographs of what the interior would have looked like in its day.
Okay.
So inadvertently, there was a historical preservation of those photographs because they were crime scene photographs. So she uses those to do this renovation and to put the house back to what it would have looked like at the time that the last of the family lived there. She there are so many stories about footsteps going through, doors opening and closing on their own, um, gunshots, a woman crying, sobbing as though she's, just devastated. But through all of it, this woman has lived in this building and reconstructed everything, and she's brought it back to life, and possibly that has a little bit to do with why the building has become so active. And I just thought it was a really interesting and unusual story. It has lots of mystery still woven into it. So
Yeah.
that is that story. We're going to go to Toronto, Canada, for a place called the Keg Mansion next. So the Keg Mansion was built um, in 1915 by the Massey family. Hart Massey and his family built it. The legend is that Hart Massey, he was a big businessman, and he was very, very well to do. So the home is huge and very Victorian looking in its style. And he had one daughter. Her name was Lillian. And when Hart and his family died, they left everything to their only child, Lillian, who grew old in this house without ever having married. It's just kind of almost like a relic out of time. But the servants there really loved her. They'd been with her, some of them almost a lifetime.
Mhm.
And she had other family from, distant family that came in, cousins and what have you, that also kind of oversaw things for her. She got to be elderly and what have you. But so Lillian is now very old. She's ill and she's dying. And everybody knows this is kind of the last hurrah for Miss Lillian. And the servants are, quiet and reserved, and they're caring for her. They love her. Everybody talked, everything I read about this woman, she was very well loved. So as she dies with the doctor standing there, he goes to the stairwell and he yells down to the servants, Miss Lillian has passed. And not unknown to them, there was a servant's bathroom on the second floor, and they had it opened up, the roof ceiling of it, to do some repairs. One of the maids at the house had strung a rope over this, I guess it would have been a floor joist, and had wrapped the rope around her neck, and it was just beside the stairwell. So she walked out the stairwell, which was only like 3 or 4 feet from that, and
That's enough. Yeah.
she threw herself over the stairs and hung
Yeah.
herself.
Yeah. Hmm.
And this happened within minutes of them telling the staff that Miss Lillian passed away. So there are several stories about why the young lady did what she did. There are two theories. One is that she was so devastated by the loss of Miss Lillian, who she had always known her whole life, and she was scared that with Miss Lillian gone, there was no income for her, and she had an infant son. Or
Okay. Yeah.
or that one of the cousins had gotten her pregnant, and the child was from one of the Massey cousins, and that this, she was afraid, was going to come out once all this stuff, the dust settles from Miss Lillian's death. Those are the two theories. And I don't know which one is right. To this day, nobody knows which one is right. They do know that right after all of this, before the house is shut down, there was a young boy who fell down the stairs right by where the maid had hung herself. He tripped and rolled down the stairs and he died. There are many stories of hearing children playing at the foot of the stairwell. There are many, many stories of people coming up the stairwell and suddenly looking up and seeing the maid hanging. I can't imagine. There are stories that Miss Lillian has been seen in the house, in her probably her 40s. She was older than that when she died, but she seems to have returned in about her 40s, fairly close to the age of a portrait that was painted of her. And then there are these odd occurrences where people report feeling pushed near the oval vestibule, or they witness doors opening and closing as if people are going into the den or the dining hall. And you follow through behind them, and there's never anyone there. And then in 1975, the building got a whole new lease on life, and the building is very full of people now. And so there's lots of people saying that they have seen activity. Most of them, the guests of the Keg Steakhouse and Bar. So they've turned the first floor of the building into a beautiful restaurant. And the second floor is used for administration and an apartment for, up there and what have you. But the stories have only grown as people have come in, even people who are not from the area, who have no clue, who will talk about seeing this grand lady in her 40s, sailing through the room as though she owned the joint, because she did own the joint. And, very scared, guests who look up the stairwell and see a person hanging, or the sound of children laughing and running past them. So it's a very interesting place. And if anybody wants to check it out and have a good steak dinner, you're welcome to give it a shot.
So it's still open.
Yes, as far as I
Okay.
could tell, it was still open. Yeah. And they actually do like ghost walks and stuff like that as well. So, it definitely could still be there. And interestingly enough, one of the Masseys became an actor. His name was Vincent Massey. He was an actor in the 1940s and 50s. And there's photographs of him playing like Abraham Lincoln. He was that tall, gawky kind of looking dude, so he fit the part pretty well. And I just thought it was a really interesting story. Very beautiful mansion, very interesting place. Now we're headed off for Australia.
Okay.
We're going to some place called the Monte Cristo Homestead. This is a two-story Victorian mansion built by a pioneer named Christopher William Crawley in New South Wales, in the town of Junee in 1885. It was his homestead, and it was just riddled with death. Like, this house had I don't know, curse to it almost. So, for example, there's stories of a stable boy who burned to death in a fire. There was a baby girl thrown down the stairs, a maid who committed suicide by jumping over the balcony, a caretaker shot dead, and many other deaths, not to mention just the normal deaths of a house, with people living in it. And the house has got a really checkered reputation. One of the things I found interesting is that whenever people go in and they take pictures of the house, they talk about something called the crawlies, the creepy crawlies. They say they are caught on the walls. They look like little shadows climbing the wall. And the house is currently being lived in by a private family, but they do open it from time to time. It's really a beautiful home. It's got this fan-like, looks like it might be wrought iron, but it's painted like a greenish white. Balconies and what have you. Just very, very pretty. So in total, the house has had 11 people reportedly die on the property. And so it's just got a lot of weird history. So according to the stories, the stable boy actually inadvertently committed suicide. And by that, I mean, he didn't want to go to work. He was just a kid. He was, from the sound of it, about 12, 13 years old. And he didn't want to go to work. So he set a fire in his mattress. and he thought that that would kind of just, you know, there'd be this hubbub, and he would get a couple days off while they tried to sort everything out. But instead, he ends up getting pinned in the room and dies. The maid who killed herself, there are bloodstains from where she fell to this day. They've bleached them, they've removed things, they've painted over them. Doesn't help. It is believed that she was pregnant to William Crawley, who, and there are rumors, although that's all they are, that have always followed around, that Mrs. Crawley found out that this was her husband, who was the father of the child, and that she and this woman had a fight, and she didn't jump off the balcony, she was pushed. So in 61, there was a caretaker shot dead on the property by a boy from town who, I don't understand how people can be influenced like this, but there are people who are. So there was a kid, apparently the movie in town was Psycho, you know, the Alfred Hitchcock
Mm-hmm.
thriller. And this kid had gone to see it, and he had stolen a gun from somebody in his home, and he went out and was prowling around the property. And when the caretaker caught him, he shot the caretaker. And when the police caught a hold of him and asked him why, he said he did it because he wanted to be like the guy in Psycho. There was another boy about 7 years old who fell down the main staircase and died. And Mrs. Crowley is known to be seen on the property quite often. There's a interesting little quote: "We don't have a week go by without someone having a reaction to the house by either fainting, asthma attacks, hearing things, and or seeing full-bodied apparitions," says Lawrence Ryan, whose family now owns the house. And he was doing an interview with something called the Ghost Project in 2015. He said most people that don't see Mrs. Crowley, she only appears when she doesn't like the people coming in, so she thinks that they're common or whatever. She'll make an appearance and get them to leave. And then he says, well, it's nothing ever bad, but they tend to leave us alone who live in the house. But some of them aren't keen on the visitors. Everything in the house that happens is really interesting. None of it terrifying. For example, your dress will be pulled, somebody will shove your shoulder, and if she doesn't like you, she makes sure she lets you know. So there is a disturbing story that is attached to the front door of the house, and it involves a man by the name of Harold Steele. He was the son of the maid who died shortly after giving birth. So that was the maid who was pregnant. She smashes to the ground and I guess she gives birth before she passes away a few hours later. They take the baby somehow. Anyway, so he is born in the house, and the family doesn't really know what to do with him. He would have ended up in a foundling home, so they decided to hold on to him and raise him, which could again be because his daddy is the guy who owns the house, or not. It could just be a genuinely, kind impulse. I don't know which. Anyway, as this boy Harold grows up, he is involved in a carriage accident where a carriage runs him over. And as a result of this, he has some traumatic brain injury and becomes aggressive. And the family doesn't know what to do with him because he's truly aggressive, like he will hurt you aggressive. So they end up with him chained in the back of the cottage for more than
Ooh.
30 years while they had a caregiver there to see to his needs, make sure he got food and was, cleaned up every so often. And it says after all the years of him being chained in that back room, his hair was dreadlocked and he used to howl at night. The locals in Junee thought it was a monster chained in the house, and the kids would go and search for it. Harold would growl and hiss at them like an animal. People still hear those sounds at night, although Harold died long ago. And Mr. Ryan, the gentleman who owns the property now, he says those who opt to stay at night in the servants' quarters following a candlelight ghost tour tell us that they never have, that they either get the best night's sleep of their life or they are not allowed to sleep at all. He's like, I don't know why It is that way, but it is. He says, I always feel like someone's watching me, and I've had a hand on my shoulder. I have felt somebody shake me. I've heard my name called. I hear footsteps walking on the balcony. You turn to look and there's never anyone there. So it is, still a private home, but they do tours different times of the year. It's a fascinating property. So now we come to a couple houses in the United States. Um, Everybody knows about Johnny Depp, the actor. What they don't know is that Johnny Depp has a portfolio of houses. He owns 5 townhouses. He owns a villa in France, and he used to own a house on Sweetser Street in Sunset Strip, Western Hollywood. Now, this place was a Bavarian castle. It was literally built to be a Bavarian castle. When that trial happened between him and his wife, Amber Heard,
Mhm.
one of the exhibits was this really weird snippet of film. Now, Amber Heard would not live in the castle. It wasn't her cup of tea, apparently. She fluctuated between 3 of the 5 townhouses, but she had been at the castle off and on, and she doesn't say anything about it being haunted, but what she does have is that piece of footage that she plays in the trial to say that Johnny Depp is insane. Now, what it is Johnny Depp is standing in the kitchen of this house, this beautiful house on Sweetser Avenue, and he's kicking and banging and slamming the cabinets, yelling, "You mother effer, stop it, stop trying to do this to me." And he's very agitated, as though something else is going on, and he's responding to it by slamming the cabinet doors back shut. It didn't obviously work to her benefit, but this footage was played. So she had caught it, and she's like, he thinks the house is haunted. And he's crazy, but maybe not. So this house is really a well-known property. There were a lot of very rich owners, a lot of heavy-duty parties that went on there and what have you. Now, Depp bought the house in 1995, and he got it from the estate of an attorney who, I don't know if anybody will remember this. Maybe you'll remember Lee Marvin, the actor.
Right.
He had that palimony suit that kind of changed how his ex-mistress had a palimony suit against him. It was the first time it had ever been done, and it made a lot of TV and what have you at the time. The attorney for the mistress owned this. He was a divorce attorney, and he was making the argument that because Lee Marvin had lived with her for so many years, she was in essence entitled to half of his property. And she wins. But the part they didn't tell you about is that the attorney ends up going to jail for breaking the law. Basically, he embezzled money and tried to shake down people and things like that. So he ends up going to jail, and this was his home. So Depp buys it after, he goes to jail. It goes up for sale, and he just thinks it's a beautiful home. It was it was sitting for quite a while. This attorney Mitchelson, was in prison, and he finally had to just liquidate his assets to continue to survive. So when Depp buys it, he spent a lot of time renovating it. He brought in big trees to hide the front of it so it wasn't as open for people to see it. He brought in other homes to put around it to make it less noticeable. Like, he went to a lot of expense, and he paid a huge amount of money for this house. And he just went crazy on it. Now, the castle was designed in 1931, and it was built by a woman named Hersey Moody Carson. She was eccentric, formerly a school teacher from Louisiana, who married wealth, and she was married 4 times. So husband number 1 and husband number 2 weren't super rich, but husband number 3 was rolling in it. And husband number 4, who was illiterate, had quit school at the 2nd grade, had made a huge amount of money, and so she married him when her third husband died. So husband number three's name was Peter Gross. He was a Beverly Hills businessman. He committed suicide because he was being blackmailed by his housekeeper because he was having an affair, and he thought that Percy was going to take him for everything he was worth, so he just stopped the process. And then, like I said, she married a guy by the name of George Campbell Carson. Now, Carson was a coal miner with a second grade education, but he had sued this huge mine company he had worked for because he had built and designed and patented a device that they ended up using in the mine, but they stole it from him and broke the patent. And eventually he wins $20 million in 1925. Moves to Hollywood.
Yes. Yeah,
Yeah,
sizable sum then.
it is a sizable sum then. I could live with it now even. And he meets this woman and she meets his bank account from the sound of things. And she went off on a huge shopping spree. She bought, Louis the 14th furniture, Hepplewhite cabinetry. She dubbed the castle Monte Karma in honor of the karma that had put her in this position. And now there's a little bit of a dichotomy. She hired 100 workers to build this house. She built a 7,500 square foot castle. She designed it herself as she went along. No expenses were spared, and her husband never tried to stop her from the sound of things. He just let her run. There was 125 stained glass windows, hand-painted wallpaper, an underground conveyor belt running from the street to the kitchen for deliveries. Once the castle was completed in 33, Hersey divorced Carson, who died the following year after cutting her out of his will, and she sued Carson's family and won. Now, all of that said, there's this weird, and I ran across this in multiple places, guys, this weird dichotomy that in her later years, Ms. Carson, Hersey Carson, would become the fairy lady because during the beginning of World War II and right before that, she had no children of her own. So she would invite children from foundling homes in and throw these elaborate parties just to awe them. And she would dress up in these airy fairy like dresses, and she was Glenda the Good Witch is what she reminded me of. And every time I'd read this, I would like, this is Glenda the Good Witch. She's got a little fairy thing, and she's like, oh, to you I will give this, and and so the children called her the fairy lady, but everything else about her is very mercenary. So during the end of World War II, Los Angeles ends up taking her home because she can't pay the $9,000 of taxes anymore. She's burned through everything. She dies in 1972 at the age of 93. The place was then leased out as a burlesque dancer who turned it into a boarding house. She had 38 renters there, among them a comedy writer who you might recognize. He would later on be Bob Hope.
Okay.
And the house just has a checkered past. And in the 50s, it was occupied by Howard Hughes's right-hand man, a guy by the name of Noah Dietrich, who was tasked with making Hughes the richest man in the world. He ran RKO Pictures, TWA Airlines, and every part of the business for Hughes. So he was a very mega wealthy man. In the 70s, there were several owners. There's now this one is somewhat disputed. That was not Barry Gordy, but Barry Gordon who owned it, but they were both like music moguls. And Diana Ross had been there. Then Depp buys it. He loans the house out to Orlando Bloom for a while, and then Bloom is he bails on the house after something happens in the house. Like he literally runs out in the middle of the night and refuses to ever go back. So then Depp takes back the house, and Bloom would never talk about it. So the things that they do talk about as that the house has, there's stories of Hersey haunting the house, of the sound of children's laughter there, of servants walking out of walls and what have you, cabinets and cupboards opening and closing as per the footage at the trial. That the house, everybody that wrote about the house that had ever been to the house, they talk about it being a sad house, a very, like, you always feel like there's somebody looking over your shoulder. You feel creepy and very sad. And I just, it was a very odd house, and it has a lot of just strange history to it. There were huge, huge parties. There were stories of people who died from overdoses of drugs and what have you at these parties, but it all got hushed up because of the type of people it was. So we're now going to move on to one of the two houses that we're going to talk about that um, you've probably heard of before. A lot of people know that in New Orleans, there's a home called the LaLaurie House. And the LaLaurie House has a very bad history. It's probably one of the darkest histories you can imagine. So I want to start out with Madame LaLaurie and her husband, who was a doctor, came to New Orleans, and they purchased this home that had been previously built by another person. And this is of interest to me, I think, more psychologically than anything else. But she was a Creole. Now, Creole is a person who is part European and part African by, mixed race. And in they would call you French Creole or just Creole, depending on where you were from. And she was a Creole woman. I've seen paintings of her. She was very pale skinned, very dark haired, very beautiful and thin. And at first, she was the height of the cream of society. And her husband were rubbing elbows with all the right people. She would say all the right things. She did own slaves, as many well-to-do people did. But she was very kind to them in public, and she would be very um, gentle with them, speaking to them very kindly and what have you. However, there were these odd little stories. You know, the servants talk.
No, I've never
And
experienced that myself, but
well, that's what I hear. The servants talk. Either do I. The only thing that can talk around here is be my cat. And anyway, like servants would talk about, she would whip some of her slaves and stuff like this. And eventually, there were these moments when she'd slip up, the mask would slip, and she would say or do something cruel and cutting to a slave. And people just started like, that's just not necessary. Why are you doing that? And then there's a fire at the LaLaurie house. It was set by a black slave who was a cook in the kitchen when the smoke's rolling out of the house and the house is on fire, and people come pouring in to help to try to put it out and get everybody out of the house. A nightmare is discovered. The cook is chained to the stove, literally.
ooh,
And later she would tell them that she was trying to burn the house down to kill herself because she didn't want anything more to do with Madame LaLaurie because she was so hateful and painful. She tortured him. There's just no other way to say it. So they get her out of the house and they go upstairs looking for more people. In the one section of the attic, they find a little over a dozen slaves chained in the attic. Some of them are dead. They've got multiple broken limbs. They're tortured horrendously. Um, they've been surgically altered, eyes gouged out, tongues cut out, genitals removed. They're just horribly just mangled. God help them. And some of them don't survive and some of them do. So Mrs. LaLaurie and Dr. LaLaurie are among those watching the house. And when they realize that their secret is out, they very quietly catch a carriage and buy tickets to go to France on a boat and sail very rapidly. out of New Orleans while they're still looking for them. Now, interestingly enough, my first instinct was at this time frame, we're talking like 1830s, there was still a lot of anatomy things that like doctors were still buying bodies so that they could practice anatomy. And as Frankensteinish as it is, I could see a doctor doing specific surgeries on people to find out what the results of them are. But the slaves who survived tell him it's not Dr. LaLaurie, it was his wife Delphine who did all of this. And he just knew about it, but didn't know what to do, so he just kept his mouth shut. So she does end up dying in France. She's never brought to trial for what she did. And the house, of course, had a bad reputation. It's passed on for quite a while. Now, over the years, the house has been a boarding house, it's been apartments, it's been lots of things. And it was eventually returned to being a private residence. There have been people who have lived in it, and they all tell the same story. It is that they hear people crying, groaning, screaming, chains rattling. Something pushes them down the stairs. A woman in a black dress that looks very much like paintings of Madame LaLaurie has been seen at night, all the way up through the years. At one point, it was a school for girls in 1874, and eventually the school moved out of the building because the girls would tell the teachers and the headmistress that they were being beaten, like they had bruises and bites and scratches, and they would be asked where this was coming from, and they would say the lady in the black dress did it to them at night. And eventually it got to the point where your kids aren't going to get sent to the school where you're paying for private education if they're coming home with these horrendous stories and bruises and bites. So they moved out. There was a school teacher there who taught music and dance, and everything went well for a little while. And then this is almost like a possession. There were improprieties accused of happening between her and the girls, and she had no history of this prior. And once she left there, she had a nervous breakdown and never taught again. Tenants that when it was apartments or boarding house, they came and they went very quickly, and there was a furniture store there was a bar there. Nothing ever lasted very long. And recently, the house has been remodeled again, and they have found what they now call the graveyard under the floorboards at the back of the house. They have found multiple skeletal remains, thinking these are servants and slaves that were killed by LaLaurie and done away with before all this other stuff, and nobody knew to pull up the flooring to do it. And now, there's another interesting little facet. This is one of the reasons I brought it up. So actor Nicolas Cage purchased the place whenever it fell into foreclosure in 2009. In 2007, he began the process, and he ended up getting it in 2009. He said, and I quote, "I just thought it was a great place to write the great American horror novel, but I didn't get to write the novel there." So he bought the house, he moved in, and his life began to fall apart. He eventually, 2 years later, has never written the book. His acting projects, are not being successful. He ends up losing everything through foreclosure, and until he leaves the house, nothing financially seems to go well for him. So he left the house 2 years after he came, and he said he felt drawn to this house and its history. He knew about it his whole life. He specifically sought this house out because he felt like he needed to own it, that he wanted to own it for that reason. But from the moment he walked through the doors of the LaLaurie house, he experienced the footsteps, whisperings, the lady in the black dress, the whole 9 yards. And he said his whole life just fell apart. So obviously it didn't work out the way he wanted it to. There are two last stories, and one of them is Heaven's Gate. So those who,
Uh-huh.
yeah.
Mhm.
So there was this cult that rented a beautiful mansion in Southern California, and it was called the Heaven's Gate Cult. They believed that aliens were riding behind Hale-Bopp Comet, the Halley's Comet, and that they were coming to take these people away with them. I think there was like 37 of them, something like that. Now, one of the two leaders of this cult had died previous to the comet coming. His remaining partner was running the cult at that time. There was a male and a woman, but they were androgynous. He had actually had his genitals removed so that he could not have sex because, and so had several of the other men, because sex was considered a distraction. And so the woman who was still running the cult, she convinces them that the aliens are coming for them, that they must leave their physical mass behind them. And so they get these little costumes and they have their shoes, and it's a very eerie thing. You can look the pictures up if you so desire. They all
Yeah,
lay
the
down.
pictures of all the matching sneakers and everything is just
Yeah,
yeah, yeah.
yeah, just creepy.
Mhm.
So they're all wearing the same clothes. They drink a drug to make them very tired and sleepy, and to suppress their respiration. They put um, plastic bags over their heads and suffocate themselves to death, laying on their little cots. And the photographs are eerie and creepy and just horrible.
Mhm.
And I'm really glad that that's not part of what I went through. So the house at the time was rented for $7,000 a month, and the owner, can you imagine? You know,
Mm.
he had no clue. They were nice people. They paid their bills on time, never gave him any trouble. And he just thought, okay, yay. And then after this, what do you do? How do you handle such a thing? This is the absolute epitome of a stigmatized property. So, he sends up selling the property for less than a third of what it's worth to get out from under it. He just doesn't want anything more to do with it. And eventually, um, the house is removed. Another house. This is the part that I found really weird about this story, is that a owner purchased the house in '99, and then they eventually tore the house down because it was a stigmatized property. Nobody wants to live in a house where 30 some people died. So, but they built another house that looks almost identical to it on the same spot. And they eventually get the addresses changed so that you can't find the house by looking at the address from the actual time period of when it happened. The house has a completely different address now. I'm not going to say it because, I mean, you can look it up if you want to look it up, but like, I can't imagine that those people would enjoy having anybody visiting for that reason. However, the property, um, they report not the house so much, but the property. There are um, footsteps. There's just this eerie feeling about the property, as though there are people walking with you, or that you're not alone ever on the property. And, if you can still visit the property, you can get up to the gates, you can see what it looked like. It's very similar. They changed almost nothing. Like, they tore the house down, but put up another one that was very similar in style, and everything else pretty much stays the same. And they don't speak at all about there being any hauntings, but people who have come there to like pay respects, family members, people who knew people who died there. Unfortunately, there is a morbid curiosity, so there's those people as well. Um, have reported that feeling of being eerie, this silence, no sound, footsteps walking beside you when you turn and there's nobody there, that kind of thing. And it will probably always be a property that has stories associated with it. After all, like I said, 30 some people died there, almost 40. So it's got a really weird vibe, and people that go there talk about it being haunted. They also talk about seeing people with matching sneakers walking along the driveway from time to
Mhm.
time. Now, is
Hmm.
that imagination? I don't know. Can't tell you. So our last story is definitely a story that everybody knows about, and it is 150 Cielo Drive, where the Tate murders happened. Now, a very quick background. I'm pretty sure most everybody knows the story, but just out of fairness, so Sharon Tate was a young actress, beautiful young woman, married to a director by the name of Roman Polanski. They rented this house
Mhm.
at Cielo Drive. A lot of people thought they owned it, but they did not. So they just rented this house. They were tenants. And Roman Polanski is a very problematic character, very flawed character. He lost his Lifetime Achievement Award for films because he confessed that he raped a 13-year-old girl in Southern California after Sharon Tate's death. He was implicated in raping other girls and in Europe. He lives in Europe now and can't come back to the United States, or he's got an arrest warrant. Now, there's a book called Chaos, and in the book, they touch on the subject of this. And Bugliosi, who was the man who prosecuted the murderers, would tell Tom O'Neill, the author of the book Chaos, which is an alternative history of what happened in the 60s and 70s. Fascinating read if you ever get a chance to read it. I highly recommend it. It's like one book you should not die with not reading. It'll totally change your universe. Anyway, Tom O'Neill interviews Bugliosi, the prosecutor, and he says, "Tell me something that isn't in your book that the public doesn't know." And Bugliosi comes back with her husband, Polanski, returned to the house because he wanted to retrieve something, but we had already found it and then put it back. That something was a videotape that he had made of him forcing her to have sex with other men while he watched. He was a very problematic figure. So like everybody likes to paint them as this amazing, power couple, so wonderful. But people who knew her in that time frame said that when she got pregnant, he didn't want to be a father, so he had tried to force her to have an abortion. She refused to have an abortion. Instead, she said she was going to have this baby even if she had to do it by herself. He starts calling her names. He stays in Europe to quote unquote finish a film. She returns home. This explains something that I was always puzzled about, because the night that in August, when the Manson family breaks into the house to murder the inhabitants, she's sitting there with her former fiance, Jay Sebring. And she also has Wolchek Frowalski, who was dating Abigail Folger in Folger Coffee, and Abigail Folger was also there. There was also another boy, it's like 18, 19-year-old boy. His name was Stephen Parent. He had nothing to do with the Tates and all of this. He just happened that the caretaker for the property was a buddy of his, and he was going up to see his friend. And when he stopped at the gate, they got him and they killed him. And then they moved into the main event at the house. And by the testimony of those who were the murderers, eventually they would admit that they murdered Jay Sebring because they tied them both up to get like with a rope over one of the poles that ran across the living room roof. And Sharon Tate was tied to one piece of the rope, and Jay Sebring was tied to another. She was being verbally and physically abused, and Jay Sebring was trying to lunge at them and stop them and screaming for them to stop hurting Sharon. So they murdered him to shut him up. And then eventually they murdered um, Wolchek and Abigail, who were in other parts of the house. They made it outside and they were murdered in the front yard. That's the story. Now, that's the story as far as it goes. If you read that book, Chaos, you're going to find an entirely alternative narrative for everything. I promise you. And I'm not going to get into that because it would take an hour and a half, and we're not going to go an hour and a half longer, I promise. But what I want to say is, after this, the house is sitting there. It's still owned by somebody, and he doesn't know what the heck to do with the house, right? Like, what do you do with a house where 4 people are murdered so horribly? And so he ends up eventually selling the house. Somebody else purchases the home, but they don't want to live in it. Eventually, it becomes a rental property again. And in 1993, the last person to live in the house would be Trent Reznor from Nine Inch Nails. He's
Hmm.
a musical artist, for those who don't know. He's renting the house because he likes the weird vibe of it, and he's shooting an album, recording an album there. He takes the room where Jay Sebring and Sharon Tate were murdered and turns that into the record studio. It is at this property where he would record the song Hurt, that is more famously known for Johnny Cash singing it later on. And the album was called The Downward Spiral. Now, he thought it was kind of, I don't want to say he thought it was a joke, but it was just funny, poppy, creepy, cool kind of a deal. You know what I'm saying? He takes the front door where they had scrawled in blood, in Sharon Tate's blood, the word pig at the time of the murder. And he names his studio La Pig because he thinks it's funny. And eventually he will steal the door from that house, that same door, which ends up being the only piece of that house that still exists to this day, because after he left, um, the house was torn down. But that's not the end of the haunting. And that's why I wanted to tell this story again, because there's another whole chapter that people don't know. So anyway, to finish up with Trent Reznor, Trent Reznor thought, like I said, it was all kitschy and kind of cool and what have you. But by accident, I don't believe there's accidents. I think he was given his comeuppance. Um, he bumps into Sharon Tate's sister, and she says, "Are you trying to make money off of my poor sister's reputation?" You know? And he's like, she's devastated by this to this day. You've seen her on TV many times talk about it, and she's devastated. And he says this is the first time he actually realized this was like not just a historical note. Here were real life people who were really in pain because of
Hmm.
what happened. And he said um, that it was the first time he realized that this was somebody's sister. He said, I went home that night and I started yelling, F Charlie Manson. I went home and I cried that night. It made me see that there's other sides to these things, you know? So then I couldn't stay there anymore and I moved out. At that point, the house was torn down. The property was renamed. The road is renamed. The address is different, like the previous one. And the property is segmented because it was a huge property with, uh, more than one house on it and other buildings and what have you. So a guy by the name of Oman, last name Oman, buys, him and his dad buy a piece of the property. Another house is put on the part where the house was where Sharon Tate was murdered. And then he builds about 150 feet from that old home. He builds another house, a smaller house. And it is at that point that the second wave of stuff happens. So at the beginning, nobody talked about the house being haunted, but nobody would stay there. They would talk about it being sad, about it being a terrible energy, that kind of stuff. But during the construction, Omen would have a worker tell him that he would hear voices and footsteps coming from the top floor of the structure, but he knew he was in the house alone. He said, on further inspection, I would always find there was nobody there. Others claim to hear voices and footsteps and to feel a breeze on the back of their necks. Then in July of 2004, Oman woke from a deep sleep at 2 a.m. to the full body apparition of somebody at the bottom of his bed pointing towards the driveway that led to the murder house site. And he says there was no sound. He points out at that area where the house had been 3 times and then disappears. At that point, Oman hadn't really, like, he's a young guy, so he really hadn't seen all the photographs, and he didn't go into the history of the whole thing. So he goes and gets crime scene photographs. They're in books. They're easy to find.
Mhm.
And to his shock, he sees Jay Sebring. That was the man at the foot of the bed. And again, there was no sound. So nothing, there was no sound of them coming in. No warning. It just happened. And that starts the haunting, if you will. And from that point on, he said that he actually went down and talked to the LA police department. They let him see some of the photos. He said there was a bloody piece of clothing. There was a knife. There were other things that carried the DNA. And he said, that's how I began to get so involved in this. And then here's something that I find really interesting. So he goes out and he talks to paranormal people. Now, he doesn't talk to just it wasn't calling ghost hunters at the time. Okay. One of the first people he reaches out to is parapsychologist Barry Taft, who's had 4,000 cases in this that he's investigated. This dude has a beyond a doctorate. Like, this is one of the most highly respected people in the field in the world. Okay. And he gets him to come to check the place out. He's like, I don't know what's going on there. Taft would leave saying this place is so haunted. He called it the Disneyland for the dead. He's like, there's just death all over this property. Not doing it, not doing it. And he said, and then Oman says, I've always felt like I'm not alone here. I'm not afraid of werewolves or fictitious characters. And I know life is more than we see. Besides, I'm way more scared of the living than the dead, but that doesn't mean I don't feel like I'm never alone. I know there's something here. And there have been other people who've come there to ghost hunt. Zach Bagans was there. There were other groups that were there, all of which have, had EVPs and what have you. But the thing that I find interesting is that there are photographs that have been captured in that house, mostly by not by the ghost hunting groups as much as by family members, like holidays and stuff, where they see flashing, floating lights in the house. And there have been psychics and people who've come, including James Van Prague, who have said the same thing, that they can feel that there's spirits all around. This is 150 feet from where the main house would have originally sat. And so apparently there is stuff going on. This has been going on since 2004, when he and his father bought the property to put a small house up. Because, and I say small relatively because they're very well-to-do people, but compared to a lot of the houses. So it's something that's still going on. So I brought this story as our last story tonight because I think it's a really interesting continuation, how everything has changed. The property's name has changed. The address of the street has changed. The call numbers on the houses have changed. And yet by changing it, I think they actually disturbed the spirits of the dead. And now it's very active property. And with that, I am done.
All right. Well, thank you for those. And then I will say good night, and you will say
Good night, everybody. I hope you enjoyed the stories.